Yeah, I've
Yes.
seen movies.
Yes.
But to know that it's happening like
I mean,
right here, right
there's
now.
all kinds of stories in Kentucky, even of parents selling their children. So there was a couple of a mom and the boyfriend were selling her teenage daughters. Well, actually, they were in middle school at the local movie theater for gift cards, gas cards to frequent customers there at the movie theater. And that was the sex trafficking end.
Welcome to this episode of Help Me Understand with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey. Today, my guest is Dr. Candace Hansford. Dr. Hansford is a professor of social work and counseling at Campbellsville University. She's very involved in research in a wide range of social issues, and her primary interests are in human trafficking, global problems, and international social work, the advocacy of, and poverty. In particular, she has done extensive research in the area of human trafficking around the globe and has written about that experience. Wow, that sounds like a lot and a little bit risky too. I can't imagine what, being on the trail of human traffickers is like.
Yes, well, my main research was human trafficking case management and assessment. So it was kind of on the back end of victims and survivors pieces.
So you weren't knocking on doors saying, I know, CSI or something.
Or
right?
Taken and those movies. Yeah,
Right,
no,
yeah.
not quite that much. So yeah, more victim services pieces.
So you saw the aftermath of what
Yes.
goes on, and it's global. I mean,
Yes, definitely. It's happening here in Kentucky and all around the U.S. and definitely all around the globe for sure.
I guess that's the part that I didn't really understand much until I could see it happening in a third world country.
Sure.
But I really did. It surprised me that it's a national, if not, it's a local thing.
For sure. Like we could probably draw a 5 to 10 mile radius around where we're sitting right now and probably find up to 3 to 10 human trafficking victims right now in where we're at this radius.
That's disturbing.
Yes.
And surprising and
Yes.
disturbing.
Yes.
And so before we get into that, let me just ask you about social work.
Sure.
Like as a professor in that discipline, what is social work? What does that mean?
Well, social work is primarily the discipline of helping people and making sure that as a social worker that you're building programming and social policies to make sure that needs are being taken care of with people. And we work with a range of different social issues and social problems, from things like poverty, homelessness, obviously human trafficking, any kind of social issue or problem like that you can think of. Social work is immediately in there, kind of on the ground, we're getting our hands dirty, making sure that people are equipped with the skills that they need to make their life better and manageable. And then also fighting against any kind of injustices or structural oppressions that kind of prevent people from being the best that they can be.
How does that differ from sociology?
Okay, so we're probably the hands-on approach piece to sociology. So sociology is the study of all of those problems.
So theoretical
Yes,
approach.
very much theoretical. And then we kind of take it a step further where we're actually working with those population groups. We're actually working with the people. We're actually trying to make changes from within. We primarily deal kind of with the person and environment issue, and so we look at it in those pieces and actually help the people that they're kind of just studying and talking about.
So you get to see how all that's happening firsthand.
Definitely.
The practical,
all the time.
and even to some degree, how the theories inform practice and vice versa.
Yes, very much so.
Do you think there needs to be a closer alignment, or do you think that? Because
we would love that. I mean, sociology kind of has its own segment here and social work here. I mean, we all obviously share those theories and things like that. It would be wonderful if there was a better partnership between the two, but, we're kind of on our piece here and dealing with this like I said, hands-on approaches and they're kind of more that theoretical
So y'all
pieces.
get your hands dirty while they sit back in the
Yes.
Well, that's unfortunate. Let me tell you why that happened.
I mean, we do share evidence-based practice pieces, so obviously we get those about what is actually working with the people and kind of pass that on through research. And so they would learn some of those pieces in, and then they would kind of do research that we would learn from as well.
Yeah, in some ways more of a qualitative approach
Yes.
to
Well, we definitely do qualitative. We do quantitative as well, but qualitative is very much so what we do on a natural basis with our clients on a one-on-one all the time. Like I teach my students, you're continually being a qualitative researcher when you're finding out their story and what they've been through and why they've come to you for aid or help or such.
But then it also sounds like you do a little bit of, I don't know if psychology would be the right word. I mean, you are helping them and trying to understand what's going on, but I mean, is that?
Sort of. Psychology deals more just primarily the brain and the functioning, but we deal with the environment as well. So obviously we have people that go into mental health counseling and things like that, but we take it from that person and environment approach. So you can go to counseling and get counseling and help, but when you get put back in that same environment, say like domestic violence or human trafficking or things like that, we have to deal within that environmental factors as well. So we focus on that element more so than just the brain pieces.
Yeah, and that sounds like there's a lot of complexity. Compounding variables, as we would say.
And mediating
research.
variables all the time, for sure.
What got you interested in social work?
Oh, wow. So I actually didn't even know there was a social work major when I went to college. So I actually majored in religion. And I found out about a social work minor. I started in a psychology as well. So I started out as psychology. I actually wanted to be a psychiatrist and go to med school.
Okay.
And once I found out about social work and kind of their philosophy and how they look at different pieces, I immediately kind of switched, and then all they had to offer was a minor at my school. So I did a minor, and then eventually I got my MSW, which is a master's in social work, and then I got my PhD in social work as well.
Okay, so there wasn't like a defining event other than just your own personal interest and a curiosity.
Kind of my journey. A lot of people that go into social work, they have things that happen in their background that kind of spawn that.
Yeah.
I mean, I wanted to help people and show that kind of Christ love through that social work ministry type pieces.
Yeah, so the religion piece of it. I mean, what was your interest there? And just knowing a little bit about you, I know that that's a foundation for you. But,
Sure.
What were you thinking about going into that major, and then like how has that been a foundation for you?
Well, I was actually the only girl at the time, the only female in my class.
Breaking some barriers.
So I went to a fellow Baptist institution, and so at that time I was kind of the only female there. So that was a little awkward at first. I grew up extremely Southern Baptist, missionary Baptist, even to that effect. So very strict upbringing. I actually didn't want to major in religion. I felt the Lord calling me into that area. As I said, they didn't have a social work major. I would have probably double majored in that. And I just felt like that was something the Lord wanted me to do.
Well, let's then get back to human trafficking. What is that?
So human trafficking is a horrendous human rights violation where people are either through force, fraud, or coercion, they're kind of taken for either sex trafficking or labor trafficking. So there's basically two different types of trafficking that is going on. When most people watch movies or think things about it, they think more along the lines of sex trafficking, but we also have labor trafficking as well. Even in the state of Kentucky, we have a huge area of labor trafficking because the horse trade. And so there's different elements that go along with that, but you have to have one of those three elements, either force, fraud, or coercion, or anyone under the age of 18 that are caught in any kind of trafficking situation, they're automatically determined as human trafficking victims because they can't legally, identify
even if mentally they might have been calling some shots, their age would put them
determine
in a
that
category.
for sure. I mean, for example, we had some in one of the local high schools here several years ago that were being trafficked out. And so
What does that look like? And I want to hear more about
Sure.
like what it is, but I'm thinking, how does that look like? They're going to high school,
It
but yet
happens in
they're
so many different ways. It is so crazy the way that traffickers manipulate and groom their victims. And so we can talk about, like, we could be here forever to talk about all different types of scenarios. So the one that happened here, they were actually in high school and they were recruited by a guy. He was actually from the country of Colombia, but he also lived in Colombia. And I know it's a little hard and confusing, but he would pick them up after school and take them to parties and traffic them out to men in the local areas. It was actually being done through Mexican restaurants in 3 counties. That's one scenario. I actually,
Wow.
yes, yes.
I couldn't even put that scenario. I mean, when you connect the dots, I'm like, okay, but I would have never been able to write that script.
Well, and I actually use a book in my undergrad human trafficking class. It's called The Slave Across the Street. It's by Teresa Flores. It's a wonderful book. It's a horrific testimony that she has that happened to her, but it actually also kind of gives us this whole frame of reference to look at trafficking in a different way. She was actually being trafficked. She was 15 and 16 during the time, and she was trafficked out by boys in her own school because one had manipulated her and took pictures that were kind of unsavory, and then he used those to blackmail her and caught her up in a trafficking ring. And so this is her testimony throughout this book. She actually runs an anti-trafficking organization now in the States and does wonderful work. She speaks all over the country. So if people are interested, that is a wonderful book that I would recommend, The Slave Across the Street by Teresa Flores. And that gives you a different kind of outlook on it as well.
Yeah, and so it brings up the question, like, who are these people? Number one, not both the ones committing the crime, but then just the person across the street tells you a lot right there.
Definitely.
It could be anybody.
Yes, and in the United States, there are lots of situations and scenarios where it was basically anybody. But now we also have a huge proponent of human trafficking, what leads into trafficking, and that is poverty or absolute poverty. And so that is a precipitating factor for it as well, especially when we talk about South countries. So countries which you might know as kind of third world countries. These South countries have huge problems with trafficking because of that. Also, natural disasters, wars, things going on also are proponents of this. So obviously the war between Russia and Ukraine right now is a huge concern for me because it's displacing a lot of people. That is like a market for traffickers trying to draw people in
because of safety and security
and security. They lie to them about, hey, I have a place that's safe for you, and they take them and then they're tricked into trafficking. I mean, there's all different kinds of things that are going on, and so that's a huge precipitating factor as well.
I guess when I thought about it, I would think about those scenarios where you're actually taken out of an environment and put in another environment, but what you talked about earlier was being in that environment, which is just an everyday thing. So you're in high school, but then find yourself somehow
manipulated and tricked and coerced to do things that you would never have ever thought. And like Teresa's story, she was scared to death. She grew up Catholic. If her family had saw some of these unsavory pictures, she was mortified, and that shame was a driven factor. And we see that in a lot of other cultures as well. So actually, during my sabbatical, we lived in Thailand for a while, and I did research there. So some of those Asian cultures have that element of shame that a lot of traffickers will use as well to manipulate women to do what they want.
A psychological cell is
Definitely. I mean,
or prison.
yes, for sure. I mean, a lot of things that you've seen on TV, that Hollywood is kind of, highlighted, trafficking, all those scenarios are real as well in different formats, along with things of people across the street or even at massage parlors in Louisville and restaurants or nail parlors in Louisville and Lexington. I mean, we have situations all over the nation of it.
And I guess the part that's really sort of hit me that I didn't expect is how just the psychological part, just the mind games that must be
Yes.
played. It's one thing to change somebody to I don't know, something and or put them in a place where they can't get out of. But people are coming and they go to high school.
Yes.
And then they go do this, and that to me is that's surprising. It really is.
And in some areas, they will actually use high school students to recruit other high school students by offering to buy them iPhones or different things like that. And so somebody that used to be involved in one way now become a recruiter in another way. And think about it, if you live in a extremely impoverished area and you have no choices about a lot of opportunities, and you were tricked into this, and then they're feeding you money or different items, then you then recruit other girls at your school and things like that.
Moving up the sort of I don't want to make a undue reference, but like the corporate hierarchy, right?
Sort of,
So
to
you get
yes.
people underneath you, and maybe your job, you don't have to do some of
change
those.
a little bit, yes.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yes. I mean, the biggest thing about human trafficking is there's a lot of myths that go behind it. One of the myths is kind of this piece here is a lot of people don't realize that it's happening in our own communities. It's happening where everybody is in our own state, in our own nation. And it's real. The problem is human trafficking is so hidden that we actually can't see it like we can see some other social problems that we study. So for example, if we drove to Louisville or Lexington or some other urban areas, we could probably see homelessness, people out. But with human trafficking, it's hidden. We can't see that. And so people, because they don't see it out and about, they just assume it's only happening in these South countries.
So some of the examples have been, I guess, around the sex trade.
Yes.
What about the labor part of it? And I mean, that's a whole nother branch, I guess, as you mentioned earlier.
It is, for sure. So that is that second type. Most of the trafficking situations we have is about 80% sex trafficking and about 20% labor trafficking. So you can see it is, more high in that sex trafficking piece, but labor trafficking is real as well. And so a lot of times for that, they will bring in people from other South countries to work in certain industries. So agriculture, as I mentioned earlier, we have the horse trade here in Kentucky. And so that is a driving factor from a lot of people from the Latino and Hispanic countries, where they're bringing them in to kind of work in that area. And a lot of those pieces are labor trafficking.
So whereas I guess in both cases you can take them out of an environment,
Yes.
but they take them out of the environment that they had, put them here where they know no one and maybe don't even speak the language,
Yes.
and know that if they get caught, they're probably going to go back to wherever they,
Yes, well, that and a lot of traffickers lie. They lie about trusting the police and what's going to happen to them if they try to seek help. Like there was a situation several years ago with Subway restaurants in Lexington. So they had brought in
Subway?
Yes, they had brought in a lot of people from the country of India. And so they were housing them and busing them into the restaurants themselves. They were not paying them, they were not letting them leave. And so those are all those proponents
So
of
they're
trafficking.
the ones sort of behind the scenes doing all the prepping and all the stuff. You might not see them,
Yes.
but they're there behind the scenes. This whole thing is incredible. And yeah, I've
Yes.
seen movies.
Yes.
But to know that it's happening like
There's
right now.
all kinds of stories in Kentucky, even of parents selling their children. So there was a couple of a mom and the boyfriend were selling her teenage daughters. Well, actually, they were in middle school at the local movie theater for gift cards, gas cards to frequent customers there at the movie theater, and that was the sex trafficking in. Those were parents selling their own kids. So we have situations of that. We have situations of pedophiles that are abusing children that then traffic them out to other pedophiles. We have, I could go on and on. There was a cardiologist that brought somebody over for domestic help. He didn't pay her. He didn't let her go. Not wages, and so that's an element of labor trafficking. So and those were all here in the state of Kentucky.
Wow. So I was going to ask, like, where does this happen most? But it sounds like it happens most everywhere.
Yes, it happens here. Actually, one of the missions that I've started, so although I'm in social work, working in this area, we're not the ones that actually see the victims or survivors first. It's actually the medical field. So I've actually been trying to guest lecture in some of the nursing classes. I've actually been visiting hospitals to do human trafficking training because they're the ones that are actually going to see these victims first. And as a matter of fact, there was a hospital in a county over from us that there was a young girl there. She didn't know where she was at, which is a huge sign of human trafficking. She didn't really have any paperwork with her. She pretended to be a different age than she was. They lie a lot of times about their age, or the traffickers make up stories for them to tell. She was from Arizona.
They make them more afraid of authorities.
Oh, totally, and not to trust people. And that just happened in a hospital over from us a few months ago. And so it really is happening all around us. And one of the things for the state of Kentucky, most of the survivors and victims that have been rescued or found have been from community tip lines. So there's a national hotline, a human trafficking hotline ran by Polaris Project, which is the main organization for the whole nation. And so they take calls from community members, from trafficking victims themselves to try to help them get out, lots of things. But for the state of Kentucky, most of the ones that have been found have come from people just like you and me and other people that may be watching, community victims that said, hey, this just doesn't look right. I've never seen them out except for this restaurant or except for this nail salon. I've never seen them shopping at the grocery store or anything like that, and they've just called in, or you can even text Be Free and just share kind of that, inclination that you may have. And you may also be one that would help rescue a survivor or a victim.
How does that scenario, because I want to get to where social work comes into, but I sort of want to start at the point of, number one, recognition, and you just talked about that. There are some signs. So, in let's say the medical field, somebody is brought in. Now, that's got to be sort of uncomfortable for that victim if the person who's trafficking them is sort of nearby to be able to. So, if you don't mind, just helping me understand, like, what does that how does that play out? What does that look like? And being able to identify it and then move it forward to the point where a social worker can step in.
Sure. So for the medical field, let's say a trafficker does bring his or her girl in to get some kind of services. Now, There is something that I do want to bring up. So we have more trafficking and more, it's also called modern day slavery. So we have more modern day slavery now than we did in the transatlantic slave trade. So that's also hard for a lot of people to understand. So we have lots more now than ever. But if one,
Well, let me try to sort of quantify that a little
Sure.
bit. So when you say more now, like in terms of numbers or
Sure.
percentage, like
Sure.
help me understand how big this problem is.
So one thing is, because it's so hidden, we don't actually have finite numbers on it. But the last guess and estimate with all the statistics that we have is there are about 30 million people in human trafficking today.
Worldwide.
Worldwide.
Okay.
Yes. So that would mean, so if we all stood hand in hand across the globe, so just thinking about the earth, it would wrap all the way around once and almost a fourth. That's how many people we're talking about right now during this day and time. Now, it probably is higher because we don't know those actual numbers and statistics. But that's probably...
You sort of, I guess you base that on victims that
Yes.
are found
Yes.
and what, how many people were...
go missing, young girls are gone, missing, things like that. So there's lots of ways that they calculate that.
Okay. So it's big.
It is big, and it's even sometimes hard for us to fathom how big it is because of, not seeing those things, as I've shared before.
Sorry to interrupt.
No. But anyway, going back to the medical field, so when someone comes in, the medical field does have, if they're think there's some kind of weird thing going on with maybe a boyfriend type bringing a girl in, they will separate them. And so they will ask them specific poignant questions about that relationship. And so I've been advocating, so in the medical field, there's a domestic violence screening tool that's in most of the assessment forms. So I've been advocating that a human trafficking piece be tacked onto that as well, because then they can ask, are you free to go? Or come and go as you please. If they've admitted to some kind of sex
just like
element,
domestic violence sort of things, but asking,
poignant questions with that. And so if they're free to leave in their situation, if they have their own access to their own monies, their own transportation, where they live, because a lot of trafficking victims are transported where they're supposed to go, or they're even held in houses where they're not allowed to leave on their own. Right. So some of those questions are being asked. If they find out that that person is a trafficking victim, then they can call the hotline, and then the hotline starts that process in connection with social work.
Okay. Well, is there law enforcement involved between there? Okay.
Yes, there would be law enforcement and different pieces that would be along with that.
But you might even, would social work come in conjunction with? Okay,
yes,
so
definitely.
It happens pretty early in the process.
Depending on what type of medical facility it is, so if it's a hospital that has a medical social worker there, that social worker then would also be brought in. I've had calls from former students that actually work, as a hospital social worker saying, help, I think I have a trafficking victim in my room right now. And so I've helped her go through scenarios or help them go through scenarios of what to do.
That's got to be a real wake-up call to be in a situation that you heard your instructor talk about, but, I've never, and then one day, there you are.
For sure. But luckily they knew who to call and, some steps to start that process. The biggest thing is, if medical professionals are listening or whatever, to get that hotline number in the hands of that person. Yeah. Because a lot of times, and this is something a lot of people don't understand as well, sometimes they will have a cell phone, but it's being monitored by the trafficker. And so sometimes they could maybe text something out or call at different times. Now, that's not always the scenario. A lot of trafficking victims do not have access to cell phones and things like that. But to get here in the States, to get that hotline number or that text number off to those victims is one of the biggest things that people can do.
Before I ask more about and so social work shows up, the thought what are some of the demographics? You've given me an idea of the scope of this thing, which saddens me.
Yeah, so I mean, it is a heart-wrenching topic for sure, because you could actually see your own daughters or your own nieces or your friends of your family or people getting caught up in this in different scenarios.
Yeah.
And so, our goal is to educate people as well. That's one goal of social work with human trafficking, is to make sure we get this out. And that awareness piece, that is one of the biggest things, to be proactive, not only with the community, but other potential victims. And so with that demographic, it depends sort of what country that you're in. So if you're in what I would call a North country, which is more industrialized, sort of like us, or, Great Britain, Australia, you're going to have basically a demographic sort of anybody that could get caught up in it, but we still have some of that poverty pieces playing out.
Right.
In the South country, it's predominantly the absolute poverty or extreme poverty, that where people have no options at all to feed their children or help with their family. And so they believe these false advertisements about job opportunities and things like that. And so they get caught up into those. A
glimmer of hope. Let's
yes, totally.
grab onto it.
Because we have a difficult time sometimes understanding absolute poverty, because we have poverty here in the States, but we don't actually have absolute poverty where children are dying from preventable diseases like every so many seconds, and where people have to choose what child to feed at that day.
Wow.
And so we have a hard time understanding that, because we have so many safe social work safety net programs here in the States. We have backpack programs. Most of the school systems have free lunch programs. We have obviously food stamps. So we have safety net programs to prevent that absolute poverty from happening. But I've lived in Tanzania, and it's a total difference where these people have absolutely nothing. And the elements where they try to grow their own foods, if there's flooding, extra rains that break that down, they have nowhere to go.
Civil wars and others.
Civil wars especially, and so they have nowhere to go, or they flee out of their countries because they have absolutely nothing.
From a demographic standpoint, of course, you've talked a lot about the sex trafficking part of it, but is it primarily female-based?
Yes, so 80%, almost along the same lines of the sex and labor trafficking, about 80% are women and children, and then around 20% are men and boys. Now, we are seeing some different elements with sexual identity pieces, trans, things like that. They're coming in. That number is getting raised, and a lot of that are young boys. So we do see that number, unfortunately, raising, but that's kind of along that demographics, that piece is kind of those elements.
So poverty and being abject or absolute poverty and female in a third world country, you're really high
yes.
Likelihood of
yes.
Being involved in this.
Yes. Now, the difference between what we know as transatlantic slave trade and the modern day slavery now is a lot of these traffickers see these recruitees or people they've trafficking as disposable, because there's such a huge area of people in extreme poverty that are just still there, that if there's girl gets used up, we'll just murder her or kill her or get her addicted to drugs, and we'll just get somebody else, because there's always somebody waiting.
Okay, that end result of so once you've been used up,
yep,
the end result is.
Not all the time, but a lot of times, because you can tell on them. So we have some pockets in certain areas of the world, it's tied into crime. So, mobs and things like that. And so you have trafficking rings, human trafficking rings that are tied into that criminal organizations as well. And so they think not even once or twice about just murdering somebody once they've expelled their use for them.
Wow. Well, let's move on to.
I'm telling you, it is a hard topic to talk about. I mean, it is really
And
heart-wrenching.
you've seen the impact firsthand too.
Yes,
I mean, that's got to be difficult.
The victims, I mean, so the survivors, once they reach a certain area, so they obviously have a lot of post-traumatic stress disorders and a lot of trauma that's there. So our services in that area deal a lot with informed trauma elements, a lot of counseling pieces, because some of these women and children have literally been locked up maybe for years and told when they're allowed to go to the bathroom, when they're allowed to eat, when they're allowed to sleep. So, I mean,
with the threat of violence sort of
all
always.
the time. Threat of violence. They're being raped on a constantly basis, if not by the clients or Johns, by the traffickers. And so it's this extreme layering of trauma that they have to sift through. And so there's lots of wonderful organizations all over the world that are ministering and working with trafficking survivors in these services. And they're doing great works. I mean, this is a hard population to work in, but there are a lot of people with wonderful hearts and great degrees that are actually ministering and working in these areas.
How does that look from, so you're a survivor and you found a safe place, and I guess the goal is to get you back into society, and I mean, I'm guessing, I don't know. What is the goal?
Some point,
and
you want them to be self-reliant and self-sufficient, but it comes with this process of, you know, maybe having to move into some transitional housing. Obviously, trusting people is a huge thing that they eventually have to continually to work through as well. And so there's different areas of type of living situations that they can transition in and out of to help with that as well. But it is a long process for a lot of these victims. But if you go on YouTube and some other sites, there's lots of victim survivor stories that are out there that have done wonderful works working with other trafficking survivors as well. Because, you know, they know what they went through. They know a lot of the same similar things that these victims have gone through. And so they have wonderful services they are doing as well.
What was your area of interest in, you know, more, because it's now I've realized how big of a, and how encompassing and interdisciplinary in a lot of ways.
Sure.
What were you focusing in on primarily in your studies?
Well, let me kind of take you back. And so this is, I'll be going into my 18th year here at Campbellsville University, which is hard to believe, but, and so probably about 2008, I had students that started coming to me saying, I feel like God is leading me to work with human trafficking, that He's leading me to work with this population group. Well, at that time, nobody knew anything at all about it.
So we're going back 12 years, 15 years maybe.
Something like that.
And it wasn't really on everybody'd sort of heard of it, but.
Movies, you know, but it was that Hollywood's made this up for this movie.
Or it might happen down, as you call the South
countries,
but,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so there wasn't anything really going on at all at that time except for the Polaris Project. And they were the only ones that had any information. And so all these students all at one time started coming to me wanting to learn about this. They said they felt this was their calling. So I just started trying to gain as much knowledge as I could about it. I called Polaris Project. I looked at everything and researched and, you know, everything to try to help plan some kind of opportunity for these students because, you know, that is my role to help them in their calling. And within
Little
all of
did you
those,
know.
little did I know that this would open up a whole kind of new passion area for me once I really found out all the pieces about it. And since then, we now have 2 full classes that are dedicated just to human trafficking, and then I teach a class that we do a whole week on human trafficking. So it's built into our curricula, and it's been there basically since that time period. And so it's exciting. We were actually one of the first schools ever of social work to have any kind of element in human trafficking at all. And then I was able to get sabbatical, and during that sabbatical, I focused mainly on case management and assessment pieces of human trafficking survivors and victims. So kind of those victim services elements.
What is that? Case management and what?
Assessment.
So,
So in social work, one piece of social work is case management that we do. So when you have a client come to you, they're probably needing some kind of services, maybe with poverty, transportation, employment, food, childcare, something like that. So case management helps get those services to the client or the client to those services to meet the needs that are there so that they can become successful in their life. So if they have a job but they don't have a car to get to their job, so we can help maybe depending on where you're at with bus transportation, taxi, and then help them build that into their own life and teach them kind of these problem-solving skills to help them be able to solve maybe crises or things that may come up later. So with human trafficking, it's geared predominantly to what are the needs that those human trafficking victims and survivors will need once they get rescued or they escape.
and as you're talking, I realize how much we take for granted, like even transportation.
Yes.
And you know, not everywhere has a bus system, but if you've never had to
Take a
use
bus,
that or even know what, you know, how to navigate that, that's one thing.
Yes.
And then the other thing, I guess the cognitive aspects of dealing with the real world,
Yes.
and I mean, those are things that it never crossed my mind that probably intelligent. I mean, these aren't folks who these victims aren't people who are unintelligent.
No,
probably.
not at all. Most of them have been tricked, frauded or coerced, blackmailed, the threat of violence. Like, I mean, if we think about it, like, what would you do for your children if somebody was threatening you? I mean, as a parent, most people are going to do whatever it takes to protect their children or their grandchildren. And these are just people that have no choices and get caught up in some of these force issues or fraud issues or coercive issues.
And it sounds like it just gets, as it gets you drawn in, it's murkier and murkier in terms of what's going on, who you can even, turn to. I guess you can't even turn to your fellow victims if you even see them. I mean, this is, of course, my only point of reference is movies,
Sure.
and not to say that they glamorize it, but you don't get I don't think you get the full understanding of how you can be enslaved without walls or chains.
Even in your own home and be trafficked while you're living in your own home. Yes, I mean, it does defy a lot of the frame of reference that we come from, and that's why, I would encourage viewers to read some of these books and watch some of these things, because that gives us a whole different element to know the reality of what actually is going on with human trafficking.
What are some of the challenges that social work faces in terms of or even just the understanding of human trafficking in a larger degree? What are some of the challenges?
Sure. One of the big ones is community or lack of community awareness. So that to me is one of the biggest pieces, is that people don't really understand that this is going on all around them. It's going on maybe in restaurants that you frequently eat at. It's going on maybe, nail salons that women visit. It's going on all around around us. So I think that is one of the biggest things, is we have that myth that it's not happening here, because
So
it
the
is.
person doing your nails, who's chatting with you, sort of, might not,
Could, yes.
could possibly not be there of their own
Free will.
free will.
Yes. Yes.
That's disturbing. Fascinating, because I can't believe it, and disturbing.
Mm-hmm. Well, even restaurants, people eat out all the time, and there's restaurants that have brought in, maybe kids from other countries to help, or other victims to help, and they're caught up in labor trafficking and different things like that. I mean, that is probably the number one thing, is breaking through that education and awareness piece for the community to really understand that this is a horrific human rights violation that's going on right now, this day and time. And unfortunately, it's continuing to go on because there's some element somewhere where people feel that it's okay to use a human as a service or a product. And there's some kind of breakdown in our societies that are allowing this to continually take root.
And it's not a something from the past,
No.
because we know that in the past people would, during wars, or if a society or community would be raided, they might take those people, force them into slavery, and it's just the tactics are different.
Well, it's the mentality behind it. So in the transatlantic slave trade, the owners of slaves during that time saw an investment. And so even though they treated them horribly and it should have never happened, they tried to at least keep them healthy to a point, because they saw that as an investment in their crop sharing or things like that. The viewpoint now is people are disposable. So I can get, 5 or 6 girls, and then a year later, I'll just get 5 or 6 more. And there are traffickers that are on different levels that are in South countries that are watching young little girls, and they're grooming families there. And these families trust these kind of middlemen, what we call them, and trust these people. And they're like, oh, when your daughter gets 12, I have a place in the United States where we can send her for education. And some of these countries, these South countries, if somebody tells you they're going to educate your daughter in the United States, that's like the dream of all dreams. And so everybody wants to believe it. But he's actually grooming this family and grooming this little girl. And then when she turns of age, then they take her and bring her into trafficking pieces, probably here in the United States.
So the as the transatlantic slave trade, what I guess I had always thought about is this, wherever and whenever it had happened throughout history seems brutal.
Yes.
Take you
For sure.
and put you in my service,
For
and
sure.
your property essentially.
Yes.
And but this seems more nefarious, more. Even more brutal than that. If that's
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, because there's a lack of care and concern in some aspects of that. And like I said, they continually manipulate their behavior to serve others' sex needs or others' labor needs.
Okay. Wow. Is there? I am amazed. I knew that I was going to learn a lot. I just had no idea that it would, number one, affect me the way that it did. What other challenges are there? Besides just sort of. Go ahead.
I hate to bring this up, but this is a huge connector piece as well, and a lot of people don't like to talk about it, especially in the church and church arenas. But online pornography is also fueling this as well. A lot of people don't realize that about 80% of online pornography that's being made is being made by trafficking victims. So this is people that are not there of their own free will. And so, mainly women. And so to think about that you're you're feeding into human trafficking in that arena. I also think that that's tainting people's views of healthy relationships. And so that piece also feeds into human trafficking as well. Because, obviously 80% are women and young girls and young boys. We have a huge area of men that are frequenting trafficking victims. So why? What is that? I teach my students all the time, if we didn't have demand, we wouldn't have human trafficking. So there's some kind of demand that's going on that's feeding this that used to not be there. And so obviously one of the connecting pieces for me is that online pornography and how big it's gotten and how easily accessible. Like the last study that I saw, children are introduced to online pornography. You want to guess the age?
Okay, I'll guess, but if I'm wrong and it's lower, I'm going to be really
No worries.
9.
7. 7 years old, because kids get phones at a younger age. Kids are not watched as much.
Yeah.
On YouTube, you click one thing and it goes to one thing and it goes to one thing and one thing. So kids are getting introduced to online pornography at age 7, and how that is changing I am not a brain expert by no means,
Sure.
but I have been to conferences and things where they've talked about how that rewires certain parts of the brain. And so if we have children growing up on online pornography, that is increasing that demand in a way that we've never saw fit as well.
I think, and I'm glad you brought it up. I think that it's something that, growing up and I was brought up Southern Baptist too, and one of the things you don't talk much about is
Yes.
sex and sexuality and those sort of things, and even mentioning porn outside of like a joke seems to get everybody sort of like, okay, well,
Yes.
Back to the joke. Can we move on? But I agree with you. I think it's something that that society is struggling with.
And I mean, I'll tell you, it's not just young men and men watching pornography, online pornography. The growing age group and demographic is young women between 16 to 25. So, I mean...
So the age group that's being affected, so the victim demographic that you were talking about earlier, the consumers are the same demographic.
But a different segment, though.
Different segment.
Yes.
So, so it is affecting everyone.
I think
in
so.
so many
I
ways.
mean, obviously, my own opinion, I think all of this is tied in ways that super dangerous for societies to come, and how men view women, even how women view themselves.
Right.
And I mean, I could talk about all kinds of things that would just blow your mind.
Maybe next time. let me take a couple of deep breaths. Yeah, let that one soak in. Oh my goodness.
It is crazy. I mean, like, there's child sex tourism where people take a trip just to go have sex with a child in another country. You just said
child sex tourism.
Yes.
Like going to see Disneyland.
Yes. But people will book a trip
for a child
just to go have sex with a child in another country. It's predominantly happening but who are the people going? People in the United States, people in Great Britain, people in Germany.
So the northern countries are going
yes.
to the southern countries.
Yes.
There's so many things that we just don't know. And in the meantime, we have all these other issues that are like front and center.
Sure.
But one of the things that has been common in several of the discussions I've had, and not to change the subject from pornography, and we'll have you back if you want on another, but the poverty thing.
Yes.
The poverty issue has come up in several ways and different ways, but always associated in some ways to criminal activity.
No, for sure. Poverty is a feeder, if we can say it that way, into human trafficking in lots of different ways. Labor trafficking, poverty is, a proponent in it, as well as the sex trafficking. And again, I want to make reference, we're talking about absolute or extreme poverty in most of these situations where people have no choices at all, which to me is, not what we normally see here in the States. And so this type of poverty is, a huge thing that needs to get a handle on. And actually, many countries were starting to grow out of some of this extreme poverty until COVID hit. And then COVID has actually set back decades of work that people had grown in countries. And so it's going to be very hard to see some of those pieces start happening more and more as we go in the future.
So I would like to just veer a little bit off of the human trafficking and on this poverty thing, but how it affects, from a social work standpoint, here and let's just say more domestically and more close to home, like how are you seeing poverty work out, and not necessarily in the human trafficking, but just socially, and the social impact of poverty on your job, your area?
Well, definitely poverty is a big piece for social workers to study. So we try to understand the different elements of poverty. Poverty guidelines are also what we base a lot of our social servicing program off of. So if a person hits within some of these federal poverty guidelines, then they're eligible for certain services that we give out in the United States. And so that also plays a factor. But in our classes, we talk about poverty all the time because it does feed into a lot of social issues that we study. So, homelessness, poverty can feed into that, obviously. Right. It can feed into mental health issues. It can feed into all of these different social service things that we're studying. So we talk about poverty, unfortunately, all the time, but it's a
sort
necessity.
Of a base of how
yes, it is a foundational base.
Leads into some of this other stuff.
Yes.
So from a social work standpoint, you can't necessarily, you can't just raise somebody out of poverty. And especially if they've been living in poverty and don't understand. Again, and this may be a whole nother discussion.
It is, but
so,
in generalities, we also work within the infrastructures that are set to try to help others have equal
like the
access
SNAP
to
program,
things.
And then
yes, well, even like racially and things like that. So, there are society oppressions and infrastructures that are set at different things for different people groups. And so we try to help make sure that there's equality for all to have equal access to things as well. And that can be, women or, different population groups or, even people coming into the country, just different things like that.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like there's the whole nother discussion, and maybe
yes.
even a panel discussion, as we would call it. An academic. Yes. It's because and I'm probably wrong on this, but the idea occurs to me that it's more than just giving somebody more money.
Yes,
that there's a whole mindset, there's a whole way of thinking about yourself and about just being successful. And I don't even know. With many of the people that we know, and the idea of going out and being successful, and there's sort of some rules with that go along with that, or guidelines in terms of work hard, do these sorts of things. That sort of cognitive and emotional foundation can be missing, I guess, and having to build that is...
Yes, so we have a term in social work called learned helplessness, and it's sort of, I think what you're getting at, to the point of maybe some people have maybe watched generations before them and saw them maybe like in the welfare system or things like that, and then that teaches them that. So it's kind of this learned helplessness where they feel like they don't have any other options but to do the same thing that kind of what came before them and things like that. And so, yeah, we deal with some of those pieces as well, but we also think about that environment piece, because you can change your own mindset, but if you're going into that same environment that doesn't give you an option, then you're just kind of hitting a wall all the time. So there's different pieces that go along with that.
So I guess an analogy is, an addict, where one of the common things is you need to remove yourself
Sure.
from. You can't hang out with those friends.
Sure.
You can't go and into let's say a bar and not expect that you're going to be able to
Be tempted or something.
And,
Sure.
So that environmental factor comes into play, and in ways that I really I'm only beginning to understand. And in all honesty, I've had a certain experience, and some of these things are outside that realm.
Sure.
And seeing it on TV is different than hearing about it from firsthand, and understanding what's going on a little bit better there. Do you have anything else I have one final question, but it's
Sure.
it's a pop quiz. No, do you have anything else you want to add?
No, I mean, the biggest thing is just encourage people to learn more about human trafficking, because it is going on around us. One of the things that I try to caution people is, we don't want to live in fear. Once people start hearing some of this, they're like super fearful. I don't feel like God wants us to be fearful, but I do believe He wants us to be extremely wise about all of these things. And one of those ways is to begin to educate yourself about more of these things, and your viewers and things like that. And the biggest website, as I mentioned several times, is Polaris Project. And they have all of these things on there that you can go on and learn about all these pieces.
We'll definitely add that as an informational link for
Thank
sure.
you.
So one of my interest is in artificial intelligence, and teaching business technology here at Campbellsville. How do you think what do you think the impact of technology / artificial intelligence is going to be on your discipline and social work, and even human trafficking, to be maybe more precise?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a hard one to kind of think about. I mean, we have simulations with certain things now that people are using in social work. So obviously we practice skills that we have to learn and teach our students. So there are different simulation things that are coming up that we've never experienced before, that you can help educate people with that. I think that is just on that edge of some of those pieces. I also have seen in other countries that there are, for lack of a better term, like a love robot that they're buying that is simulating all of these pieces of a mate. And so I don't know how that will have an effect on human trafficking. I don't know if that will decrease some of these pieces. Like, we've saw gender ratios skewed in a lot of countries because of infant feticide or femalicide, things like,
yeah.
yes. So we've seen some gender ratios skewed in those areas where these men now are buying wives from other countries and things like that.
So a wife shortage, or a partner shortage.
Yes, in certain cultures and certain countries, they're feeling that right now really badly. So if you get a wife from another country, how do you see her? As your property, right? That you bought her and brought her over. So there's some pieces with that. So I don't know if this kind of thing of these, robots will, decrease some of that. I don't know. Honestly, I don't think so. I think it might enhance it in a different way, a different fetish route or something like that.
Yeah, I was thinking even from a labor standpoint, okay, I can buy a robot that's going to be around for years, and maybe that would alleviate the need to, have go through the risk of trying to get, labor And then, bringing up the love robot sort of thing. I mean, you could see that in a similar route vein. I guess one of the things that comes to mind is, okay, as these robots evolve, if you will,
Sure.
the development, they get to a certain point where, and not to get too much into, is it going to be, is a sentient being or not,
Sure.
but at what point is it all, is it always property? Like a robot you could see is always property, but in terms of the activity of owning your sex slave, if I'm not maybe using the right words, but that activity, is that even right?
Sure.
I mean, it goes.
We could go on with a lot of moral pieces all day long with all of some of those elements. But yeah, I honestly, I don't know. And this is an area, we have talked a little bit about it in some of our classes, kind of that human trafficking route and some of those pieces. But think about it. If you are wealthy enough to buy a robot, a lot of these humans are way cheaper, unfortunately, and are way more skilled than a robot.
At least now. Yeah,
at least now. And so, who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, and it comes back to the sex thing, the sex trade. Even, talking about the robots that might be most commonly, and here we are, and even, the pornography thing, I think is really, and even that, I guess, is going to change based on how, the virtual realities and all of this stuff.
Yes.
So I think you hit a real point, and I think this is true no matter what discipline. We just don't know where technology is going to allow us to go, and whether we step through that doorway unthinking, because that's where
it's totally true. And we've saw technology take on different facets of human trafficking in the last 20 years or whatever. And so that is a whole thing as well to see.
What do you, just monitoring and?
Well, no. So human trafficking used to be more like what we would think of the street walking or prostitution, where you have to go somewhere, and meet somebody face to face to purchase them.
Right.
And then all of a sudden we saw people selling people online. The first one was Backpage.com and Craigslist and things like that. So we saw that, and now we've moved to where, like in the Philippines, there may be a house that has a bunch of little children, and somebody comes on and has those children perform sex acts for them across the internet,
like in a Zoom meeting?
Yes.
Oh my.
And so we've continually saw how technology has taken on this whole new horrific thing with human trafficking. And so my guess is, as this advances, we're probably just going to keep seeing some of those pieces happening.
More beyond our ability to even think about,
comprehend things at all.
Like
when we were here talking about people selling girls on Backpage.com, I would have never dreamed of this scenario over here that's happening all the time now.
Right.
So and especially COVID.
And that has to be, from the trafficker standpoint, if you can somehow hide your locale, it's got to be safer, so you're only going to see more of it happening, and the more people with technology access. Ooh.
It is this.
Wow.
Yes, it's one thing after another that's very much so tied or intertwined with each other, because even people doing this, only so much of viewing is going to satisfy that need until they want to go find their own child to molest, or and so it's just this. It is a hard topic to talk about, and that's why I think a lot of people want to keep it hidden, is because it is some of these things that people are like, oh my gosh,
Well, I think if I'm just the average guy, I don't even know how to talk about this. In a way, in a meaningful dialogue that's not just some joke about
Sure.
pornography.
Yes.
And which I understand shouldn't be joked about, but I mean, these are really uncomfortable things, but being able to have that dialogue and be able to, and really encourage, like, hey, if we don't talk about it,
Sure.
and get it out. What's the old saying about, like the I don't know, mold needs, once it sees the shine some light on it, it might go away, or
Sure. No, I mean, definitely. The more awareness we bring to this, the better. And people talking about this, and that, I mean, that's where I think churches should be talking about online pornography. They should be talking about these things that people do when they're hidden, and, that shame piece. We need to break all that off and really deal with some of these issues, because that is perpetuating pieces of human trafficking for sure. And like, if people knew that, I think a lot of people, might think differently about online pornography or their viewing habits and things like that. Or that, a high percentage of people in those videos are being forced to do that. And it could be, like I said, it is somebody's daughter or somebody's niece and all that.
Yeah. And it could be happening across the street.
It is happening across the street.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me and helping me better understand this whole, both social work and the human trafficking piece. And
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully we can have other conversations. I might need to, yes, give a little. But I think these hard conversations is why I even wanted to start a podcast.
Yeah, sure.
Is I want to have these discussions and get back to the civil discourse and open and free sort of expression. So, again, thank you so much.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having more discussions with you.